Hey everyone, welcome to a deep dive that's going to turn everything you thought you knew about language learning upside down. We're going deep into the world of language acquisition today, and trust me, this is going to be fascinating. If you've ever wondered how we really learn languages, like what actually makes us fluent, you're in the right place. We're going to be focusing on the work of a leading expert, Dr. Stephen Krashen, and his famous input hypothesis. And we'll be pulling insights from an awesome conversation he had with Matt versus Japan, the language learning YouTuber. Get ready to have your mind blown.
One of the biggest myths out there about language learning is that it's all about cramming grammar rules and memorizing vocabulary lists. But Dr. Krashen's research throws that whole idea right out the window.
Yeah, I totally get that.
Mm.
I mean, I spent years in high school conjugating verbs and struggling to remember vocab words. And let's be honest, it didn't exactly make me fluent in anything. So what does Dr. Krashen say is the real secret sauce to language acquisition?
Well, at the heart of it all is this idea of comprehensible input. It's actually very simple. We acquire language when we understand messages. That's the key. It's not about actively studying or consciously trying to learn rules. It's about being exposed to language that you can actually understand. Think about how little kids pick up their first language. They're not sitting down with textbooks and grammar drills. They're just listening to the people around them, absorbing all that language naturally.
Right, it's like they're little sponges soaking up everything they hear. But their brains are also filtering out what doesn't make sense yet, right? They're focusing on the parts they can understand in context. That's how they get that comprehensible input without even realizing it.
Exactly. And here's the amazing part. That process doesn't stop when we get older. Our brains are still wired for language acquisition. It's like a superpower we all have. Dr. Krashen actually argues that this is the primary way we become fluent in any language, not just our native one.
So if comprehensible input is the key, does that mean all those traditional language learning methods are a waste of time? Like all that grammar drilling and vocab memorization, is that all useless?
Well, not necessarily. They can be helpful in some ways, but they're not the driving force behind real acquisition. Speaking, writing, studying grammar, those are all results of acquisition, not the cause. They happen after the brain has already absorbed and processed a good amount of comprehensible input.
Wow, that's a huge shift in thinking from how most of us were taught languages growing up. So how did Dr. Krashen even come up with this radical idea? Did he just have a eureka moment one day or what?
Actually, his research started with a deep dive into how people acquire grammatical morphemes. You know those little bits of language that modify words to express things like tense or plurality?
Okay, so we're talking about like adding S to a verb to indicate the present continuous tense, or adding S to a noun to make it plural. I get it. But there's got to be more to it than just adding an S or add here and there, right?
Yeah. Right, you hit the nail on the head. What Krashen found was that there's actually a consistent order in which people acquire these morphemes. And this order holds true regardless of their age background or even the language they're learning. For example, studies showed that both kids and adults learning English as a second language would typically acquire the ing ending before the regular past tense ed ending.
That's so interesting. It's like our brains have this hidden blueprint for how we absorb grammar, a universal order that transcends all our individual differences. But how does that connect to the idea of comprehensible input?
Well, Krashen noticed something really interesting when learners were tested on these grammatical structures. The order of acquisition could actually change in a testing situation. This suggested that conscious learning, the kind we do to prep for a test, was actually messing with the natural subconscious process of acquisition.
It's like our brains are wired to absorb language organically, but when we try to force it with rules and drills, it kind of throws a wrench in the works. It makes you wonder if maybe we've been approaching language learning all wrong this whole time.
That's a question that's been at the heart of Dr. Krashen's work. He believes that our overemphasis on conscious learning might be why so many people struggle to become fluent. To illustrate this point, he often shares a story about one of his students, Pauline Pon. She was a native Mandarin speaker, and her teenage son would playfully point out her English errors.
No, so she was making mistakes, but she was actually aware of them. That's not something you hear about every day.
I know, right? And what's even more remarkable is that Pauline could self-correct every single mistake her son pointed out. This showed that she had two distinct systems at play: acquisition. The subconscious process driven by comprehensible input allowed her to speak fluently, but then learning her conscious knowledge of grammar rules acted as a sort of monitor or editor.
Wow, it's like having two different language processors running in our brains. One that's intuitive based on exposure and experience, and another that kicks in when we consciously try to analyze and apply rules. That actually explains a lot about my own language learning struggles.
Yeah.
There are times when I can just feel the language flowing, and then other times when I get so bogged down in overthinking every little word and grammar rule.
That's a perfect example of the two systems at work. And here's the key takeaway: that conscious monitor we have, it has its limits. It can't keep up with the speed and spontaneity of a real conversation. So while grammar rules and vocab lists can be useful tools, they shouldn't be the main focus of language learning.
So you're saying that real fluency comes from that intuitive subconscious system that's powered by comprehensible input? That's pretty mind-blowing. But I'm curious, how does this idea of comprehensible input apply to someone who's not a child anymore? I mean, I'm not exactly surrounded by people speaking Italian all day long.
That's where things get really interesting. While Dr. Krashen's early research focused on how we acquire grammar, in more recent years he's shifted his attention to the power of reading as a source of comprehensible input.
That makes sense. Reading allows you to immerse yourself in the language at your own pace, without the pressure of having to keep up with a real-time conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm guessing it's not just about picking up any random book, right?
You got it. The key is to find reading material that's both engaging and comprehensible. Dr. Krashen is a big advocate of easy reading, particularly light fiction and storytelling. These genres tend to use more natural language and familiar vocabulary, making them ideal for language learners.
So ditch the textbooks and dive into a good novel. I like the sound of that. But earlier you mentioned that our conscious knowledge of grammar can sometimes interfere with the natural acquisition process. Does that mean I should just ignore grammar altogether when I'm reading?
Not necessarily. While Dr. Krashen believes that grammar study shouldn't be the main focus, he does acknowledge that it can play a supporting role. Understanding basic grammatical concepts can sometimes make the input more comprehensible.
Okay, so it's about finding that balance. We don't want to get bogged down in grammar rules. But a little bit of conscious knowledge can help us make sense of what we're reading. And that, in turn, feeds our subconscious acquisition system. It's like a positive feedback loop.
Exactly. And that brings us to another crucial point: the role of output in language acquisition. While Dr. Krashen emphasizes the importance of input, he also recognizes that output in the form of speaking and writing can contribute to fluency.
So it's not just about passively absorbing language, but also about actively using it. But I'm guessing there's more to it than just speaking as much as possible.
You're right, Dr. Krashen is very clear that output is a result, not the cause of acquisition. However, interacting in the language, getting feedback from others, can lead to more input. Think of it as a cycle. The more you understand, the better you can speak and write. And that in turn exposes you to more input, further boosting your acquisition.
Okay, that's helpful. So it's not about forcing output before you're ready, but rather allowing it to emerge naturally as a result of increased comprehension. So if speaking isn't the main driver of fluency, then what about all those language immersion programs, the ones that promise to make you fluent just by dropping you in a foreign country?
Yes, immersion. That's a common misconception. While it can definitely be helpful, it's not a guaranteed path to fluency. Dr. Krashen often uses his own experience in Austria as an example. He did well there, not simply because he was surrounded by German speakers, but because he was actively seeking out comprehensible input. He had conversations with locals, read books and newspapers, and even had a talkative landlady who provided him with tons of opportunities to practice.
So it's not just about being in the country where the language is spoken. It's about actively seeking out and engaging with comprehensible input. That makes sense. But what about accents? There's this idea that if you don't learn a language as a child, you'll never get rid of your accent. Is that true?
That's another area where Dr. Krashen challenges conventional wisdom. He believes that accents are more about identity and belonging than about the mechanics of pronunciation. He often tells this funny anecdote about a man named Gerald Mosbeck who dreaded his French class. And for the final oral exam, he decided to intentionally exaggerate his accent.
Oh no, I can already see where this is going.
And you know what? The instructor was thrilled. He praised Mosbeck for finally getting it. This story really highlights a key point. Achieving a truly native-like accent might not be just about perfecting the sounds. It might be more about joining the club of speakers, feeling like you belong to that language community.
That's fascinating. It suggests that language is more than just rules and sounds. It's also a social marker, a way of expressing our identity and signaling our affiliation with certain groups.
Exactly. And Dr. Krashen refers to this as success phobia. It's like an output filter that hinders full competence when we don't feel like part of the target language group. It's like a mental block that keeps us from fully embracing the language and achieving true fluency.
It makes you wonder if Trying too hard to sound native can actually backfire. If we're constantly worried about our accent or making mistakes, we might be less likely to engage in conversations and seek out that all-important, comprehensible input. It's almost like we need to let go of that perfectionism and just focus on communicating and connecting.
That's a great insight. And it leads us to a question that a lot of language learners grapple with. If conscious learning isn't the primary driver of acquisition, is there any value in studying grammar rules or memorizing vocabulary lists? Can those things ever be helpful, even if they're not directly used for speaking?
That's definitely something I've struggled with. I love using flashcards to learn new vocab, but I also know that just knowing the definition of a word doesn't mean I can actually use it naturally in conversation.
That's a valid point. And Dr. Krashen acknowledges that conscious knowledge, particularly of vocabulary, can play a role, especially in reading. But he's clear that it's not a substitute for comprehensible input.
So it's more like a supplemental tool that can enhance our understanding and make the input more accessible. I've definitely found that to be true in my own language learning journey. For example, when I was learning Japanese, I used a flashcard app called Anki to study vocabulary from the anime and manga I was watching and reading. It really helped me bridge the gap between content that was super compelling but sometimes a bit over my head.
That's a great example of how conscious learning can be used effectively. It's about finding the right balance between the two systems, leveraging your conscious knowledge to enhance your subconscious acquisition.
That's a really empowering message. It means we can draw on all the tools at our disposal. But ultimately, the focus should be on finding and creating opportunities for enjoyable, comprehensible input. And speaking of making things accessible, Dr. Krashen has been amazing about sharing his work with a wider audience. He's not just publishing in academic journals, he's actively engaging with language learners online. He's got a website, social media presence, and he's even been featured on popular podcasts like this one.
He's really passionate about making language learning more effective and enjoyable for everyone. He's even written letters to major newspapers like the Washington Post, connecting reading habits to issues like literacy and political discourse.
Wow, so he's really putting his ideas into action, advocating for the power of reading beyond just language learning. It sounds like Dr. Krashen is a true champion for language learners everywhere.
Absolutely. And his message is crystal clear: find what you love, make it comprehensible, and enjoy the journey.
That's a message I can definitely viscously. And it leads us to a really thought-provoking question that we'll explore further in the next part of this deep dive. If achieving a truly native-like accent requires joining the club of speakers, what does that mean for how we approach language learning and interacting with native speakers? How can we overcome those feelings of success phobia and find a sense of belonging in a new language community?
That's a question that goes beyond pronunciation and grammar. It touches on the very heart of language as a tool for connection and identity.
I can't wait to dive into that. But for now, we're going to keep rolling with this exploration of Dr. Krashen's work. We'll be discussing some practical strategies for finding and creating comprehensible input, no matter what your language learning goals may be. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. It's been amazing unpacking all these incredible ideas from Dr. Krashen. I don't know about you, but my whole perspective on language learning has been totally transformed.
It definitely challenges the traditional way of thinking about language learning, focusing on all those grammar rules and memorization.
Totally. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of how to actually apply all this, let's go back to that fascinating idea of joining the club, of speakers overcoming that success phobia Dr. Krashen talked about. What does he say about the connection between language and identity?
Well, Dr. Krashen points out that language is so much more than just a tool for communication. It's also a powerful symbol of who we are, our cultural identity and the groups we belong to.
Yeah, it's kind of like how we choose certain clothes or hairstyles to fit in with a particular group or express our own individuality. Language can do that too. It's a way of signaling who we are and where we belong.
Exactly. And when we're learning a new language, especially as adults, we're often trying to navigate this whole complex world of identity. We want to be understood, of course, but we also want to hold on to our own sense of self.
It's a tricky balance for sure. And I think that's where the fear of not sounding native comes in. We worry that if our accent isn't perfect or if we make grammatical errors, people won't accept us as part of the group, like we don't really belong.
That's a valid concern, and it's something Dr. Krashen has addressed in his research. He suggests that this fear of not being good enough can actually prevent us from becoming fluent.
So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. We're so afraid of sounding like an outsider that we end up avoiding speaking altogether, which then robs us of those opportunities for comprehensible input and real-life interaction.
You got it. It becomes this vicious cycle. And to break free, we need to change our mindset. Instead of chasing perfection, we need to embrace the journey of language learning, with all its bumps and imperfections.
It's about seeing those mistakes not as failures, but as chances to learn and grow.
I love that. But I'm curious, what does Dr. Krashen say about the actual process of developing a more native-like accent? Is it even possible for adults to achieve that level of mastery?
He believes it is possible, but it's not about trying to mimic sounds in isolation. It's about absorbing the rhythm, the intonation, the music of the language. And that comes from consistent exposure to comprehensible input. It's like learning to dance. You don't just memorize the steps, you feel the music. You let your body move with the rhythm, and eventually it becomes natural and effortless.
I love that analogy. And just like with dancing, the more you immerse yourself in the language, the more you'll naturally start to pick up those subtle nuances of pronunciation and intonation.
So it's about finding ways to surround ourselves with the language, even if we don't live in a foreign country. But let's get practical for a moment. Let's say I'm totally on board with this idea of finding comprehensible input. Where do I even begin?
Well, Dr. Krashen is a huge advocate of what he calls self-selected pleasure reading. This means finding books, articles, anything written in your target language that you genuinely enjoy reading.
So not just textbooks or grammar guides, but
Mm.
things that actually spark my interest and make me want to keep reading.
Exactly. And here's a key tip. Choose materials that are slightly below your current level of comprehension. You want to be challenged but not overwhelmed. Dr. Krashen recommends aiming for about 95% comprehension, meaning you understand most of what you're reading without constantly having to look up words.
That makes sense. It's like finding that sweet spot between being stretched just enough to learn, but not so much that you get frustrated and give up. And the good news is there are so many resources available for language learners these days, no matter what your level or interests.
That's right. There are graded readers, which are simplified versions of popular books specifically designed for language learners. There are bilingual books, which have the original text and a translation side by side. And there are even websites and apps that offer news articles and stories in various languages, all written in a way that's easier to understand.
And don't forget about the power of visuals. Comic books, graphic novels, even children's books can be great sources of comprehensible input.
Absolutely. The pictures give you context and help you figure out the meaning of words you don't know. It makes the whole reading experience more fun and engaging.
And speaking of fun, let's not forget about all the amazing audio content out there. Podcasts, audiobooks, music, YouTube videos, the possibilities are endless.
You're right. Audio is fantastic for immersing yourself in the language, especially if you're more of an auditory learner. And the best part is you can listen passively while doing other things like commuting, exercising, or even just doing chores around the house.
Multitasking for the win. And let's not forget about YouTube. It's like a treasure trove of language learning resources these days. There are channels dedicated to teaching specific languages, channels that offer cultural insights, and even channels created by language learners themselves, sharing their experiences and tips.
YouTube is a great example of how technology can be used to create a more personalized and engaging language learning experience. And it really highlights the power of community and collaboration in the language learning journey.
Because let's be real, learning a language can be tough. It takes dedication, effort, and a lot of patience. And sometimes it just helps to know that you're not alone. Connecting with other learners, sharing resources and encouragement can make a huge difference.
I completely agree. Whether it's online forums, language exchange apps, or even in-person meetups, finding your tribe can provide so much support and motivation along the way.
And speaking of motivation, I'm curious about how Dr. Krashen views its role in language acquisition. Is it all about finding the right input, or does our own desire to learn play a role as well?
Motivation is definitely key, and Dr. Krashen emphasizes the importance of finding content that you're genuinely interested in. When you're engaged and enjoying the process, you're more likely to stick with it and make progress.
Makes sense. If you're forcing yourself to read something boring or irrelevant, you're probably not going to absorb much, no matter how comprehensible the input might be. So it's about finding that sweet spot between comprehensible input and personal interest.
Exactly, and it's about setting realistic goals and celebrating your achievements along the way. Language learning is a journey, not a race. It's important to acknowledge and appreciate your progress no matter how small it may seem.
It's about focusing on the process, not just the outcome. And remembering that every step forward, every new word learned, every conversation attempted is a victory in itself. But I'm also curious, how does Dr. Krashen address the issue of forgetting? Let's say you've put in the effort, you've found your comprehensible input, you're feeling motivated. But then life happens. You take a break from studying and suddenly you feel like you've lost everything. How can we prevent that from happening?
I think that's something every language learner experiences at some point. And Dr. Krashen acknowledges that forgetting is a natural part of the process. But he believes that the more we expose ourselves to the language, the stronger those neural connections become, and the more durable our learning will be.
So it's not about memorizing isolated words or grammar rules, but rather building a deep and interconnected network of knowledge. Through repeated exposure to meaningful input.
That's it. It's like building a house. If you lay a solid foundation and keep adding bricks, the structure will become stronger and more resilient over time. And even if you take a break from building, the foundation will still be there, ready for you to pick up where you left off.
That's so reassuring. It means that even if we have setbacks or periods of inactivity, we're not starting from scratch every time. The learning is still there, embedded in our brains, just waiting to be reactivated.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the role of speaking and language acquisition. While Dr. Krashen emphasizes the importance of input, he also recognizes that output in the form of speaking and writing can really boost fluency.
Right, it's that feedback loop we were talking about earlier. The more you understand, the better you can speak and write.
Yeah.
And that in turn exposes you to even more input, further accelerating your acquisition.
You got it. But it's not just about speaking as much as possible. It's about finding opportunities for meaningful interaction.
So like having conversations with native speakers, even if they're short and simple at first.
Exactly. And if you're not in an environment where you can easily interact with native speakers, there are other options. There are language exchange apps and websites that connect you with people from all over the world. And there are online tutors and language schools that offer virtual classes.
And let's not forget the power of talking to yourself.
That's right. It may sound silly, but narrating your activities, practicing dialogues out loud, even just thinking in the language can help solidify your understanding and improve your fluency.
So it's about finding that balance between input and output, between passively absorbing the language and actively practicing it.
And it's about remembering that language learning is a journey, not a race. It's about progress, not perfection.
I love that. It takes the pressure off and allows us to enjoy the ride.
Because at the end of the day, the more we enjoy the process, the more likely we are to stick with it and achieve our goals.
And those goals might look different for everyone. Some people might be aiming for conversational fluency, while others might dream of reading literature in the original language or even becoming professional translators or interpreters.
That's the beauty of language learning. It's a journey with endless possibilities. But I think what Dr. Krashen's work ultimately shows us is that no matter what our goals, the key to success is finding and creating opportunities for enjoyable, comprehensible input.
That's a powerful message. And it's relevant not just for language learners, but for anyone who's trying to learn anything new. It's about finding what sparks your curiosity, immersing yourself in it, and trusting that your brain will do the rest.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a really important question that we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive. If achieving a truly native-like accent requires joining the club of speakers, what does that mean for how we approach language learning and interacting with native speakers? How can we overcome those feelings of success phobia and find a sense of belonging in a new language community?
That's a fascinating question. It goes beyond just pronunciation and grammar. It touches on the very essence of language as a tool for connection and identity. And we'll delve deeper into that when we return for the final part of our exploration of Dr. Stephen Krashen's input hypothesis. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Dr. Krashen's input hypothesis. We've covered a lot of ground talking about comprehensible input and how it can completely change the way we approach language learning. But now I'm sure you're thinking, okay, all this is fascinating, but how do I actually put it into practice?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the good news is it's not as complicated as you might think. Dr. Krashen's approach is all about making language learning natural and enjoyable.
Okay, so no more cramming grammar rules or memorizing endless lists of vocab.
Well, those things have their place, but they shouldn't be the main focus. Remember, the real magic happens when you immerse yourself in comprehensible input language that you can understand without too much effort.
So where can we find this magical input? You've talked about reading and listening, but can you give us some specific examples?
Absolutely. Let's start with reading, which Dr. Krashen calls self-selected pleasure reading. This means finding books, articles, magazines, anything written in your target language that you genuinely enjoy.
So if I'm learning Spanish and I love mystery novels, I should ditch the textbook and pick up a Spanish thriller.
Exactly. The goal is to get so lost in the story that you forget you're even engaging with another language. And here's a little tip. Choose materials that are slightly below your current level. Aim for about 95% comprehension. which means you can understand most of what you're reading without constantly needing to look up words.
Okay, that makes sense.
Uh,
It's like finding the right workout routine. You want it to be challenging, but not so hard that you give up. But what if I'm not a big reader? Are there other ways to get that comprehensible input?
of course. The world of audio content is a goldmine for language learners. Think podcasts, audiobooks, music, YouTube videos. There's so much out there, and it's often free.
I love listening to podcasts, so I'm all ears. But how do I know which podcasts or audiobooks are right for my level?
Start with topics that already interest you. If you're a history buff, look for podcasts about historical events in your target language. Love true crime. There are tons of international true crime podcasts out there. The key is to make it engaging so you naturally want to listen.
This is starting to sound a lot less like studying and a lot more like fun.
Exactly. And remember, you can adjust the difficulty as needed. Many podcasts offer transcripts so you can follow along as you listen, and audiobooks often have different narration speeds, so you can slow things down if you need to.
Okay, so I'm hooked on a great podcast. I'm reading books and articles.
Right.
But what about speaking? When do I actually get to use the language I'm learning?
That's a great question. And this is where that feedback loop we talked about earlier comes in. Remember, output speaking and writing is a result of acquisition, not the cause. But it's an important result because it allows you to test your understanding, get feedback, and connect with others.
So it's not about forcing myself to speak before I'm ready, but rather letting it emerge naturally as my comprehension grows.
You got it. And when you do start speaking, focus on meaningful interactions, even if they're short and simple at first. Like ordering a coffee in your target language, asking for directions, chatting with a language partner online. These small interactions can really boost your confidence and give you valuable practice.
Speaking of language partners, there are so many apps and websites now that connect language learners from all over the world. Have you found those to be helpful?
Absolutely. They can be a fantastic way to find speaking practice, especially if you're not living in a place where you can easily immerse yourself in the language. And beyond the language exchange, they provide a sense of community, which can be so motivating.
It's like having your own personal cheer squad for your language learning journey.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of talking to yourself. It might sound a little strange, but narrating your activities, practicing dialogues out loud, even just thinking in the target language can help you internalize the language and become more fluent.
I've actually caught myself thinking in Spanish a few times when I'm trying to remember where I put my keys.
That's a great sign. It means your brain is starting to absorb the language. And remember, it's okay to make mistakes. In fact, mistakes are valuable learning opportunities.
It's like that saying, you never truly lose until you stop trying. I think it applies to language learning too. But what about those times when we hit a plateau? When we feel like we're not making any progress? Any advice for pushing through those moments?
First of all, be kind to yourself. Language learning is a journey, not a race. Celebrate your achievements no matter how small they may seem.
It's like those non-scale victories people talk about with fitness. Sometimes the biggest wins aren't about hitting a specific number, but about noticing positive changes in our habits and our mindset.
Exactly. And if you're feeling discouraged, go back to the content that first made you fall in love with the language. Rewatch your favorite movie, listen to that catchy song, reread that chapter that made you laugh out loud. Reconnecting with the joy of learning can really reignite your motivation.
I love that advice. It's so easy to get caught up in that I need to be fluent by this date mindset and forget why we started learning the language in the first place.
And remember, even small, consistent efforts can lead to amazing results over time.
It's like the compound effect. Those tiny actions we take every day can accumulate and create a ripple effect that leads to big changes.
Exactly. So be patient, be persistent, and most importantly, enjoy the journey.
I think that's the most important message from Dr. Krashen's work. Language learning doesn't have to be a chore. It can be an adventure, a chance to expand our horizons, connect with new cultures, and discover new things about ourselves.
It's about embracing the process, celebrating the imperfections, and ultimately finding joy in the magic of human communication.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a challenge. What's one small step you can take today to create more opportunities for comprehensible input in your target language? Maybe it's downloading a new podcast, picking up a graphic novel, or simply spending a few minutes reading a news article online.
Remember, every little bit counts. And the more you immerse yourself in the language you love, the closer you'll get to unlocking its secrets and experiencing the world in a whole new way.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of language acquisition. We hope you've enjoyed it. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of language learning. Until then, Happy learning.